I'm not really sure what to make of this monitor or mini LED technology on the whole, at least when it comes to an ultrawide. Today we're looking at the AOC Agon Pro AG344UXM, which sports an ultra-wide 1440p resolution at 170Hz, has of course got a mini LED IPS panel with full array local dimming, display HDR1000 certification, and also has those fabled HDMI 2.1 ports. Now in the UK and at the time of filming, it can be found for roughly £1,200. So is it actually worth its price tag, and how does it compare to some of its rivals, specifically for example with OLEDs out there? Let's find out. Now to kick things off is very positive. Here its input lag was actually objectively tested at 0 milliseconds. Now here indeed it does compete with CRTs out there and very much is one of the fastest monitors that I've ever tested to date. When it came to my own subjective opinion while playing a game like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, I felt that the monitor did indeed respond extremely well, so I had no problems whatsoever. Now it's worth noting that these tests were conducted with the low input lag mode on via the OSD. There are no inherent disadvantages of indeed having it enabled, so it's just worth pointing that out. So what about when it comes to the monitor's response time? Well, here is where things get a little bit strange. Now I use the OSRTT tool in order for me to get objective data. I always do subjective testing as well, but it gives me some form of backup to just see how the monitor performs through the different overdrive modes. Now, when I did launch up the OSRTT tool, I found that I got a little pop-up warning saying there's sort of strobing that is occurring. This usually is the case if there's PWM flicker, or for example, if the monitor is using a motion blur reduction tool, but that wasn't the case with this monitor. So I just ran the test just for the sake of it, and indeed while looking at the results, which should not be trusted, I found that the monitor was indeed suffering from some sort of odd behavior. Further digging into it, I looked at the graphs that the OSRTT tool actually provided, and lo and behold, I was noting sort of spikes, which really should not be the case. You should get a sort of smooth line. So while looking around on the internet, I actually came across one of my friend's reviews, Simon from TFT Central, and he also pointed out a similar sort of behavior with this monitor. Ultimately, what we're trying to say over here is that both Simon and I couldn't actually get any sort of objective data from it. However, just looking at the rough numbers, and again not to be overly trusted, between the off and the medium preset it hovers between 7 to around 6 milliseconds. However, on the fastest mode preset, which is strong, I actually incurred around 4 to 5 milliseconds. Now, in terms of my own subjective opinion, what I will say is that these sorts of rough numbers actually back up my claims. Indeed, in this respect, running on the strongest mode overdrive, I felt that it was good for casual gaming, but not exactly suited for hardcore competitive gaming. Now granted, this is an ultra-wide monitor that runs 1440p at 170Hz, it doesn't actually incite any sort of issues in my head, because the target market isn't going to be a hardcore competitive gamer that wants the fastest response time, but rather input lag would be important. So what I'm trying to say over here is that the overall response time of the monitor was perfectly fine. Now when it came to the overall inverse ghosting, which of course might throw off a lot of people, and was something that I incurred while testing another ultra-wide monitor with a mini LED technology from ViewSonic, here I'm safe to report that even on its strongest mode overdrive, there was pretty much no inverse ghosting. Indeed, the monitor looks absolutely great across the entire overdrive range, and in this respect means that the monitor will actually be very much playable. However, you will notice that there is no MBR setting. Motion blur reduction is not featured on this monitor altogether, which is quite a shame. So next up we get onto AMD FreeSync and Nvidia G-Sync. Supposedly this monitor has a VRR range from 48Hz up to 170Hz, at least when connected correctly. And when I say that is that normally I have a display port that's connected from my RTX 3080, and for a monitor that actually on its spec page says that it's G-Sync compatible, it would lead me to think that G-Sync would work without any sort of issues. However, that wasn't the case. While running a DisplayPort cable, the monitor had flickering issues while running G-Sync. In fact, it flat out did not run the Nvidia Pendulum demo. However, things changed when I connected over HDMI. Indeed, over here, my RTX 3080 has got an HDMI 2.1 output, and it seemed to be running VRR technology, in other words G-Sync, without any sort of hitches whatsoever. Better still, I was able to run Nvidia G-Sync simultaneously at 1440p at 170Hz with also HDR, and this all worked flawlessly without any sort of problems while playing a game such as Destiny 2. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that I was not able to get G-Sync to work over DisplayPort, which is probably the go-to for a lot of people. However, HDMI did work without any sort of problems. Now, this does perfectly bring me onto its HDR experience, and quite frankly, it is spectacular. Now, it has a flat IPS panel with a mini LED structure and 1152 local dimming zones. Now, it's worth pointing out here that local dimming can be enabled or disabled in SDR. However, while running an HDR single, it actually gets permanently enabled. And yes, in case you're wondering, there's a little bit of haloing, but it really did not distract me in the slightest, be it when I was going around certain menus or even if I was playing a game. Indeed, over here, while playing Destiny 2, I was just absolutely gobsmacked by the overall experience that I was actually able to attain. The monitor does a phenomenal job of bringing out that detail, and given that it does actually get over 1000 nits in certain scenarios, it means that this monitor gives you a real HDR experience that is lifelike. Now, with all that in mind, would I pick AOC's mini LED monitor over OLED alternatives? And the answer is no. One that I've previously reviewed, for example from Philips, absolutely left me jaw-dropped when it came to its HDR experience. Indeed, it does a similar job, however it delivers me an infinite contrast ratio and far deeper black levels. And in this respect, the mini LED technology, be it from AOC or alternatives out there, really cannot compete. Simply put, the technology is there, but it's not exactly as good as what you can get in an OLED. Now, with all that out of the way, I would just like to have a quick word for console gamers. Now, I'm not one myself, so I can't attest to it, but I have a 4K Blu-ray player and I can certify that it does actually have a 4K signal input, showing good sort of scalability. However, there is also a setting via the monitor's OSD that allows you to set the HDMI ports, be it number 1 or number 2, to 120Hz, supposedly a somewhat sort of console mode. Now, while in said mode, I just found it a little bit odd, because I couldn't see the native resolution or indeed the refresh rate that was quoted. Now, looking at Simon's review, he actually also pointed out a somewhat odd behavior. Downscaling 4K was coming in perfectly, but the native resolution of the monitor was not actually being properly picked up. Or you'd have a sort of letterbox design where you'd have black bars on either side. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that I can't actually certify it to be working on modern day consoles in terms of its native resolution and at 120Hz. Now, with the gaming section out of the way, how does the monitor actually look like? Well, here it has a flat IPS panel with a 34-inch form factor, a matte coating to it that runs 1440p at 170Hz. Now, you'll be pleased to know that there's a dedicated sRGB mode that you can select through the monitor's OSD. However, it is a shame that you do not have dedicated brightness controls, and this might cause a bit of a problem for certain individuals, and you'll find out why. Now, via my calibrators, I noticed a sRGB gamut coverage of 93.5% and a gamut volume of 94.8%. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard, and of course, while in said mode, it's no surprise to see that the average delta sits at just 1.2 with a maximum of 2.25. Indeed, it's very color accurate and therefore can be used for video grading work or, for example, color editing. Now, its tested contrast ratio is actually quite disappointing, at 883:1, while its measured white point is slightly off at 5936 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it actually sits relatively close to the 2.2 standard, but you can see that it deviates slightly towards the higher end of the spectrum. Now, indeed, the monitor's contrast ratio is quite disappointing, and here, if you're going to be comparing it to an OLED, it's pretty much no competition whatsoever. Even if this monitor was hitting over 1500:1, which would be very unlikely for an IPS panel, it still wouldn't compete with the infinite to 1 that you'd get via an OLED technology. Now, nonetheless, I digress. Outside of the sRGB mode, which you might want to do specifically if you're a gamer, you've got a few different presets. For example, the warm mode. Now, in said mode, it does unlock the wider color gamut. And here you can see how it's positively affected the coverage and volume across the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 spaces. Now, tested against the latter, you can see how it compares, and as for the average delta E and maximum delta E, it shifts to 3.62 and 6.18 respectively. Again, this is in comparison to the DCI-P3 mode, not to be confused with what I was referencing before when it comes to the sRGB mode. Now, as for the measured white point, it does shift a little bit slightly at 6158 Kelvin at 100%, but unfortunately the gamma has not actually been tuned to perfection, as it doesn't sit close to the 2.6 standard, which is required by the DCI-P3 color profile. Now through my color test you might have noticed its overall brightness, so let's actually delve into it. Now in HDR it gets up to 1155 nits, which is very impressive. Similarly in SDR it gets up to 654 nits. While local dimming does dampen it a little bit to 604 nits, this is still a very good result. However, what isn't is its overall minimum brightness. It only gets down to 172 nits, or with local dimming enabled, down to 155 nits. Now this is actually a bit worrying because for those people who want to be gaming in a completely pitch black room, you'll actually find that this is too bright. Similarly, if you're going to be doing any sort of image editing work, specifically in a darker room, its sRGB mode locks it to a pretty high 310 nits. Now moving on, we get on to brightness uniformity. And here across the board it does a decent job, although I was actually expecting a little bit better results. And note this was in SDR with local dimming disabled. Similarly over here I was actually expecting a bit better when it came to its overall backlight bleed. Indeed over here it does have an IPS panel, and on my tested one, which is of course a little bit of a lottery, you can see that there's a little bit of bleed coming in towards the bottom left hand corner. Thankfully, however, this does indeed have a mini LED structure with a stonkingly high 1152 zones, and therefore when enabled, it meant that this monitor went completely pitch black, therefore alleviating any sort of backlight bleed that one might incur. And given that the local dimming can be enabled or disabled in SDR, it's something that you might want to consider. Now moving past all these tests, I would like to have a quick word about its overall build quality. And here it's got a 3-side borderless design, and therefore means that this 34-inch ultrawide doesn't actually take too much space on your desk. What does, however, is its very large stand. Now it could have been a little bit better designed, but here AOC have chosen to have a little bit of a logo projection. I don't really understand the principle of it, and therefore I suggest most people will probably want to disable it. Nonetheless over here, the stand itself did not fit on my monitor riser and actually damaged the wood that it actually sits on, and in this respect if I did own this monitor, I would be quick to replace it. Thankfully here you have got a Visa compatibility, and it means that you can actually replace the stand altogether. If however you choose to stick with it, you will be pleased to know that it's very sturdy and provides height, tilt and pivot adjustments. Given its size, it's no surprise that you can't rotate it. Now at the rear of the monitor you might have noticed a little joystick button, and indeed that's to access the monitor's OSD. Here it's comprehensively laid out, but it is actually quite unresponsive. Similarly over here, the little included puck which comes with the monitor seems to be a little bit hit and miss. In other words, it's sometimes sluggish and randomly disconnects. I'm not really sure why or if there's a fault with the puck, but it's just something I thought to report. Now through the monitor's OSD you might have noticed a sound option, and indeed over here the monitor has got a 3.5mm jack, but better still has got two 8-watt speakers with DTS sound. These actually do a pretty good job for built-in monitor speakers, but I would always recommend a set of bookshelf speakers or a headset. Nonetheless, it's great to see that the manufacturer has actually thought about producing decent audio from the monitor. Now elsewhere, I would also like to highlight that there are some fancy RGB lights that I found at the rear and underneath the monitor. These are, in my opinion, completely pointless and will just increase your power consumption, so you might actually want to disable it. If, however, for some odd reason you do want to have them enabled, then you can play around with it to your heart's content via the monitor's OSD. Now what isn't a silly inclusion, however, is the built-in KVM switch. This means that you can plug in your laptop via USB Type-C, which by the way will also deliver up to 90 watts of power, and then plug in your PC or your laptop via HDMI or DisplayPort, and then plug in your peripherals, in other words your mouse and keyboard, directly into the monitor. Meaning that when you're switching between sources, you don't have to plug or unplug your peripherals each time. A very handy feature for those people who do have different sources. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and quite frankly the AOC Agon Pro AG344UXM actually does a decent job across the board, although it's not a monitor that I actually see myself recommending, purely because of the issues that I've highlighted in this video, from the way that the G-Sync operates, the fact that the minimum brightness doesn't get as low as it should, and also the fact that you do also have some sort of slight flickering that is occurring, or sort of strobing, so it might be a cause for concern for certain individuals. It also doesn't have the fastest response time out there on the market. On that note over here, something that does would be an OLED panel. And ironically, the parent company of AOC actually does own Philips as well. And here, Philips' OLED panel is actually absolutely spectacularly good, and is one that I would actively see myself recommending it. So much so that I actually labeled it the best gaming monitor that I've ever reviewed, and that's coming from someone who's reviewed actually 230 different panels. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that if you're going to be splashing out £1,200, then you might want to look at an OLED panel. And granted, that has some of its drawbacks as well, with the way that the burn-in works and all the maintenance that's required. I just think that on the whole, that will be actually a better pick in comparison to going for a mini LED technology. Now, nonetheless, I'd be curious to know what you would pick down in the comment section below. Mini LED or OLED, or more specifically, would you like this AOC monitor to be sat on your desk? Now, if you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.